Lecture 2, Studying Pitfalls. When it comes to learning, how do you study? What does studying mean to you? How do you actually do it? And when? There are many different ways to study, and cognitive and educational psychologists have identified many empirically supported study techniques that can enhance learning. The bad news, however, is that people do not often use these learning strategies. Some of the most popular strategies are often the least effective, though they may be the easiest to use. The end result is that even people who spend a lot of time studying may still struggle to learn. So it's worthwhile to take a closer look at what successful studying actually entails and the ways that we might be doing it wrong, even when we have the best of intentions. To make the most out of our studying efforts, it's useful to consider 4 different features of studying: the what, how much, and when. What refers to the specific strategies used to learn and retain content. How refers to the specific way those strategies are implemented. How much refers to the total amount of time spent studying. And when refers to the spacing of our study time. Using this framework in this lecture, I will identify common pitfalls and provide recommendations for how to tweak our current strategies to make them more beneficial. So once more, the 4 different features of studying are what, how much, and when. Let me work through them now, though in a slightly different order, starting with the when of studying. Now, it's very common for people to mass the majority of their study time shortly before an exam or assessment. Otherwise known as cramming, this approach to the when of studying is almost always a bad idea. Not only is cramming usually a highly stressful experience, but research is clear that it doesn't promote learning or long-term retention. To be fair, cramming may be useful in a pickle. That is, when you have no other choice. Sometimes it can work well enough to help you get by. But if you are truly interested in understanding and remembering something long-term, then it's really best to space out your studying into multiple, shorter sessions across a larger time period. It also helps to break up the content into smaller, more easily digestible pieces that you can practice and review across multiple sessions. One of the best ways to do this is to literally create a study schedule for yourself where you identify and reserve specific time slots to review. And they don't have to be long. Sometimes just spending 20 to 30 minutes a day or every other day is sufficient. Spaced practice doesn't mean you are necessarily studying more or longer. 3 hours of studying broken up into 6 segments throughout the week will likely be more beneficial to your learning than spending double that amount of time cramming. If you have a tendency to rely on cramming, it might also help to reframe your definition of studying. Stop thinking of studying as something you need to do right before an assessment or merely for the assessment. And instead, think of studying as the entire learning process itself. That is, everything you do while you're engaging with the content, including what you might do to prepare for a class, how you participate during the class, and your efforts to review outside of that class. All 3 time points matter. And so the more you monitor and control engagement throughout the process, the more you will actually get from the experience. Now, as for how much one needs to study, it's difficult for me to recommend a specific amount of time because it really depends on several factors, including your current ability level and background knowledge of the content. The more challenging the content, the more time it will likely require. And this is where a certain amount of trial and error is just necessary. But in general, I would recommend erring on the side of scheduling more time for studying than not enough, as it's usually easier and more rewarding to remove study sessions from your schedule than it is to try to find extra study time when you need it. Also, the research is clear that most people have a tendency to be overconfident and to stop studying before they've actually mastered the material. Our memories are much more vulnerable than we think, and sometimes we confuse recognition or familiarity with actual understanding of the content. So even though it might feel like overkill, it's actually a good idea to overlearn by continuing to rehearse content and practice skills even after you think you've got it. It's also important to ensure that your study time is uninterrupted so that you can fully engage. The more you make efforts to eliminate or reduce distractions, and study in an environment where you can really concentrate on the content, the more valuable that time will be. For example, 15 minutes of focused studying is going to be more beneficial than 30 minutes or maybe even a whole hour of studying that is repeatedly interrupted. So find a quiet location, turn off your phone and other unnecessary electronics, and devote your attention to the task at hand. Set a timer if you have to. You also want to carefully consider what you're doing during that time. You can devote a lot of time to studying, but if you're using an ineffective strategy or implementing a strategy poorly, then that time could very well be wasted. While some people admit to not studying enough, many other learners express frustration about the lack of correspondence between the amount of time they actually study and their subsequent performance or learning. Most people increase their study time when they're struggling to learn, but often still fail to see any significant improvements. But like I tell my students, studying more is not always the answer. Sometimes it's more a matter of changing your approach. And this is where it becomes important to reflect on the what and the how of your studying. There's a subtle but important difference between those terms. As I noted earlier, what refers to the strategies you're using, and how refers to the way you're implementing those strategies. It's an important distinction because even good strategies can fail if they're incorrectly or superficially applied. And I'll elaborate on that point just a little later. When it comes to the what of studying, the most important thing to note is this. Simply put, not all strategies are equal. For example, two of the most widely used study strategies are rereading the textbook or rereading your notes and highlighting. But unfortunately, cognitive research shows that those strategies tend to be the least effective for learning and retention. On the other hand, students tend to underutilize strategies like practice testing and spaced practice, even though research shows those strategies tend to be the most beneficial for learning and performance. So there's clearly a disconnect between what research tells us we should do and what most people actually do. Why? Well, there's many reasons why we rely on ineffective strategies. For instance, they tend to be easier. Even if the strategy doesn't work very well, it feels good to say that we did something. Other times, it might be due to a lack of motivation or interest. If we really don't care about what we're learning, or if our goal is simply to pass a test in the short term, then shallow or short-term strategies might be fine. Still other times, our use of ineffective strategies may be the result of a time crunch that forces us to rely on expedient strategies. It's possible that we know better, but we resort to using them out of desperation given those circumstances. But research also shows that a lot of people simply don't know what strategies actually work best or why. Many people have the best intentions to study, but simply don't realize how their strategies set them up for failure or how they could be limiting their own learning. And I think it's important to note that teachers often hold the same misconceptions about study strategies. Teachers sometimes unwittingly give bad advice. For example, it's not uncommon for teachers to tell their students to reread the textbook. Other times, teachers may give generally good advice, but fail to specify the details. And as it turns out, the details matter. Too often, we assume that everyone knows what we mean when we say things like review your notes or read the textbook or even test yourself. But there are different ways to do all of these things, some of which are more beneficial than others. And so, in addition to looking at what strategies we're using, it's also important to consider how we are implementing them. One of the key factors that distinguishes effective from ineffective strategies is how actively they are implemented, or to what extent they require attention and mental effort, as opposed to being more rote or passive. Strategies like rewriting notes, highlighting, and summarizing tend to vary in their effectiveness based on whether they're implemented in a rote way, for instance, literally copying or transcribing notes from one place to another, or if they're implemented in a deeper, more active way, for example, reorganizing your notes to make them clearer, and or filling them in with additional information or making corrections. The first, rote transcription approach, is virtually worthless, whereas the second, more active approach is likely to be very beneficial to your learning. So the efficacy of some of the least beneficial strategies can be improved if they're implemented in a more active manner. But it's also true that the effectiveness of relatively good strategies can be diminished if they're used in a less active manner. In the rest of this lecture, I want to further delve into the how part of studying by examining two common strategies and the implementation details that make them either more or less effective. Specifically, I'll focus on reading or rereading and using flashcards as a form of self-testing. Let's start with reading and rereading. As you probably understand, reading is a pretty essential skill for learning. It's easy for people with reading disabilities to fall quickly behind their peers, which is why we place so much emphasis on early literacy skill development and interventions. That said, even skilled readers can fall into bad habits that reduce the likelihood that reading is helpful to their learning. Becoming increasingly proficient at reading is, in some ways, a double-edged sword. When we learn to read, initially it's a very active and mentally strenuous process of having to sound out letters, string phonemes together to make words, and string words together to make sentences. Think of what kids sound like when they're learning to read and how long it takes. Patience is key. The same basic process happens when you learn a second language as an adolescent or as an adult. It takes all of your focus and mental energy just to decipher the words and read the sentences, let alone interpret the meaning of those words and sentences. But the more experience you have with a language and the more fluent you become, the faster you can decode those words and sentences, which is what enables you to focus more on the meaning. Eventually, reading may become so automatic that you don't even have to consciously try to do it. It just happens, like when you see a road sign or a billboard while driving. But that automaticity also comes with a cost, which is that we often read without consciously thinking about what it is that we're reading. To illustrate, have you ever read a few pages of a book only to eventually catch yourself and realize that you weren't really paying attention and that you need to go back and reread that section? I know I do this sometimes, even for books that I'm reading for fun, let alone textbooks or articles that I'm required to read. Oftentimes, when it comes to studying for school or work, we read mostly for the sake of getting it done. It feels good to be able to check that box and say we did it. And because reading is so automatized, it's usually a pretty easy box to check. However, reading just for the sake of reading, without deliberate effort to reflect on what we're reading and why it matters, is mostly a waste of time. Just because you go through the motions doesn't mean you're actually understanding what you're reading, let alone retaining it for later use. Now, a big part of the allure of rereading something as a study strategy is that it provides the illusion of competence. When you reread a textbook, or even your own notes, you may mistakenly believe that you've mastered the content because of the associated sense of familiarity. But familiarity is not the same as understanding. Just because you recognize certain ideas when you reread them does not guarantee that you will actually remember them or that you'll be able to apply that content in a different setting. So given that reading is a necessary part of learning, how can we make it more useful as a strategy? As I mentioned earlier, the key is to ensure that you're reading in an active manner. You need to resist that urge of simply going through the motions and instead read to learn. And that involves active efforts at 3 different time points. First, before you read, take the time to peruse the chapter or article. Skim the section headings and, if provided, make a mental note of the learning objectives. What is the purpose of the reading? And what information are you supposed to retain? Take a few moments to reflect on what you already know about the topic and which areas might be new to you. Doing these things will give you a sense of what areas might be the most important or what areas might be worthy of extra attention while you read. On that note, it's also important to ensure that you'll be able to focus on reading. So as I mentioned previously, make sure you find a relatively quiet spot and make proactive efforts to remove potential distractions. The next consideration is what to do while you read. Here, the key is to ensure that you stay focused and engaged. To help prevent yourself from falling into that trap of automatic or passive reading, I recommend that you divide the reading into sections and deliberately pause after each section to reflect on what you've learned so far. Practice summarizing key points in your own words. See if you can recall and explain any key terms you encountered. Note any questions you might have about the content. Try to relate it to other things you've learned or to your own experiences. For example, if you're reading about leadership styles, consider the characteristics of the most impactful or inept leaders from your own life, or how that content relates to your own experiences in leadership roles. You might also draw connections to other sections of the same text or to things you're learning about in other courses. And it might help to literally write down insights that you have while you're reading. For example, I might make a note on a page that says something like, "This statement seems to support or contradict what was written on page 127. Or, "This reminds me of what I learned in another course when we discussed X, Y, and Z." And I do recommend that you actually jot down your ideas and questions when possible. Otherwise, they're really easy to forget. We all think we'll remember something, especially when it makes sense in our own minds at the time, but our memories are much more fleeting than we'd like to admit. Having a written record helps to ensure that you can go back and review your insights and follow up on any questions you had. I like to write in the margins of the text so that I can see where my thoughts connect to the text. But if you can't write on the text itself, at least make notes elsewhere and indicate the corresponding sections or page numbers that correspond to your notes. So a key point in all of this is that you shouldn't be waiting until after you read everything to pause and reflect or to test your understanding. The more fully you engage during the process, the less follow-up work you'll have to do, and the easier any follow-up work will be. It takes more effort up front, but the payoff is greater in the end. You can think of it as being like good craftsmanship. The more care you put into ensuring that the foundation and the framework of whatever you're building are high quality, the less likely you'll have to do major repairs down the line. And that brings me to the third and final consideration, what to do after you've read. This involves synthesizing your understanding by reviewing your notes, deliberately following up on any lingering questions, and testing yourself more thoroughly. At this point, you should revisit the learning objectives to see how well you can address them. Look through your notes and see what stands out to you. Gather more information as needed. Reorganize and clarify your notes as needed. Another great strategy is to discuss the content with someone else. See if you can summarize the entire reading in just a few sentences. A great way to think about it is like an elevator pitch. If you only had 30 seconds to explain the most important points from the text, what would you say? If the other person completed the same reading, compare your notes and offer each other feedback. If the other person knows nothing about the text, then use the opportunity to practice explaining what you learned and answering questions, which will also make you more keenly aware of how well or how little you understand it. Even explaining the content out loud to yourself can be helpful. Just be sure you're really testing your understanding and ability to recall the content and not just rereading from your notes or rereading the book again. So those are tips to make reading more effective. Next, let's discuss another strategy, self-testing through the use of flashcards. There are other ways to self-test, but flashcards tend to be the most common. For example, more than 2/3 of students report using them to study for their classes, and a large number of people use them to prepare for professional exams. But when it comes to their effectiveness, once again, the devil is in the details. When used correctly, flashcards can be a great tool for learning. However, if used inappropriately, they offer little benefit. As I described with reading, the key to using flashcards is to ensure that the process is active. There are many common mistakes that people make when using flashcards. One mistake is relying on someone else's flashcards instead of making them yourself. Sure, it may save time and effort, but one of the key benefits of flashcards comes from having to think carefully enough to write the cards in the first place. Creating the questions and prompts forces you to think through the content and essentially decide what is most important and how to ask those questions about it. This is called metacognition. You basically have to think like an instructor and design ways to test yourself before you actually test yourself. So creating the cards provides an extra level of review that you shouldn't skip. That said, you also want to think carefully about the content you include on your flashcards. Another common mistake people make is that they only include terms, definitions, and other factual type questions. To be clear, memorizing facts is sometimes important, and flashcards provide really useful drill and practice for that purpose. However, you want to make sure that your flashcards reflect all of the ways that you will be tested and what you're expected to know. If you only need to memorize facts, then you could stop there and be fine. But in many learning environments, we're expected to demonstrate a deeper understanding of the content. For instance, you might be expected to know how to apply a key term to a novel situation, or how to recognize an example in real life. Or you might be expected to compare and contrast different ideas, to evaluate the strengths and limitations of an approach, or to explain why or how something works. These objectives go beyond memorizing facts. So when you're creating your flashcards, you need to create cards that prompt you to demonstrate those skills too. If I was making flashcards, I would actually create multiple cards that cover the same basic content, but in different ways. Perhaps one card asks for a straight definition. Another card covers a key example. One or two cards focus on comparing, contrasting, or otherwise explaining the connection to other concepts. And yet another card might describe the pros and cons, or might prompt you to explain why the term or concept is important. Doing this will quickly increase the number of cards you create, but again, that means you will have even more practice thinking about the content in multiple ways and testing yourself on multiple levels, which will only strengthen your understanding and memory. Once you've created your flashcards, you also need to be careful about how you use them. I'd suggest that you keep in mind two main principles. One, as I mentioned earlier, you want to space out your studying over time. And two, you want to make it challenging. This means that, when possible, you should create and study flashcards in segments as you cover different content instead of waiting to create them all at once. Gradually add to your pile and work through it numerous times, reviewing old content and new content alike. Repeat exposure, intermixed with time and other events, is key. Remember, people have a tendency to become overconfident and to stop studying before they've actually learned the material. You may be able to answer the question accurately a few times during a single study session, but there's a good chance you won't be able to answer all of those questions a few days later. In general, the more lag time between study sessions, the more difficult it will be to remember, which is ultimately what strengthens your memory. Another way to ensure that you're adequately challenging yourself is to completely mix up your flashcards so that the topics jump around, as opposed to being grouped by theme. It's much harder to apply a concept when you haven't just recently reviewed the definition, for example. And it's just mentally harder to switch back and forth between different, unrelated ideas and skills. Cognitive psychologists call this interleaved practice, and it's sort of like cross-training for your brain. Finally, one more essential guideline for using flashcards effectively is to make yourself answer the question before you look at the answer. Maybe that sounds obvious, but many people give up and turn the card over too quickly. Have you heard of the saying, no pain, no gain? It's important to put your memory to the test and make yourself suffer with it a little bit, as you might during the actual assessment. Remember that recognizing an answer when you turn over a flashcard is not the same as being able to recall or to generate that answer on your own. So to recap, there are many different study strategies you can use to assist your learning. But hopefully you now understand that some strategies are generally more effective than others, and it's just as important to consider how much, and when you use them. Effective studying takes more mental energy, focus, and active thinking than we often apply, but the results make it worthwhile. And effective studying doesn't always mean spending more time studying. If you find yourself just going through the motions or using a strategy that doesn't take much effort or thought, chances are good that you're wasting your time. There's no real shortcut to deep or long-lasting learning, but the more active and deliberate you are throughout the learning process, the more efficient and the more worthwhile the experience will be.